Let me now introduce our awardee of the year, and that is former Secretary of Defense William Perry. You have his full bio in the program, so I won't go through that. He has a distinguished background. He's now teaching out at Stanford. He was the Secretary of Defense. As you know, he has had a number of other functions as well. Bill, Secretary Perry, could I ask you to come up and, rather than belabor the introduction, let me read the citation here. The Walter and Leonore Annenberg Award for Excellence in Diplomacy, presented by the American Academy of Diplomacy, is awarded to William J. Perry, mathematician, engineer, soldier, and businessman. William Bill Perry is the Secretary of Defense most associated with the quest to reduce nuclear weapons and build security and stability in the nuclear age, a role he has continued out of government. The American people owe him a continuing debt of gratitude. His constant concern for all his people and dependents, his careful listening, and the clarity and timeliness of his consistently correct judgments distinguished his work as Secretary of Defense. His leading role in developing the Partnership for Peace marked the quiet demise of the Cold War. It is with extraordinary pleasure that we extend our highest award to him, the 2017 Walter and Leonore Annenberg Award for Excellence in Diplomacy, signed by Tom Pickering and myself.
Thank you very much, Ron. And what a delight it is to be back here in the beautiful Benjamin Franklin Room. And what an honor to be recognized by the American Academy of Diplomacy. In yesterday's New York Times, as I'm sure most of you read, there was an article by two respected and seasoned diplomats that raised a problem of a serious crisis, they said, in the Foreign Service, and raised the specter that this might cause serious harm to our country's ability to do diplomacy. That inevitably raises the question, how important is diplomacy to our national security? I'm going to address that question with a case study. And the case study will be in the way diplomacy was used and was not used, and what's led us to the particular problem we have today with North Korea. I was involved deeply with that problem and can speak of it in the first person. In 1994, I became the Secretary of Defense, and the first crisis I faced was North Korea. They were reprocessing the spent fuel in the reactor with the idea they were going to make enough plutonium that could allow them to make 6 nuclear bombs. The President authorized me to state that we would not publicly that we would not permit them to do that, and also authorized me to prepare a plan to take out the facility at Yongbyon in case they did not respond properly. So I prepared that option and made the public statement. North Korea took this very seriously, as well they should have, because it was a serious threat. So seriously, in fact, that the party newspaper referred to me the next day, Secretary of Defense Perry, as a war maniac. In retrospect, I take this as a badge of honor. Certainly it is more original and cutting invective than they are using today on President Trump. At the time, the State Department had prepared a set of very tough sanctions, but North Korea threatened to engulf Seoul in a sea of flames, familiar language, a sea of flames, if the sanctions were imposed. That could be bombast. It probably was, but we did not dare to assume that. I advised the President before he imposed the sanctions, he should allow me to reinforce our troops in North Korea. And so in the meantime, the President authorized a visit to Pyongyang by President Carter to do some track 2 diplomacy, President Carter now being out of office. While we were in the cabinet room, literally in the cabinet room, listening to the proposal, and the President within minutes of authorizing that deployment, the meeting was interrupted with a phone call. And the phone call was from President Carter, calling from Pyongyang, who said that Kim Il-sung had agreed to a diplomatic solution to the problem. I think this can be reasonably construed as a successful example of what you might call coercive diplomacy. Bob Gallucci was appointed to lead the American diplomatic team, and in a few months, he had negotiated what came to be called the agreed framework. I believed then and now that this was an excellent agreement, but it was bitterly resented by some in and out of the Congress who led a continuing battle against it. There was particularly bitter opposition by my friend Don Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were later to play a key role in this drama. We and our allies complied with the agreement, what I would call the hard parts of the agreement. The South Korea and Japan were busy building the 2 light water reactors called for in the agreement, and the United States was supplying each year the necessary fuel oil to make up the electricity in North Korea to compensate for their reactors being shut down. But as a result of the opposition in Congress and elsewhere, President Clinton decided that complying with the soft agreements in this agreed framework, which would lead to improved relations with North Korea, would be too difficult, so we never did comply with those. And by the end of the decade, while North Korea had fully complied with shutting down the nuclear complex at Yongbyon, they continued to carry on R&D program in highly enriched uranium at a covert facility. The net of this was the agreed framework prevented North Korea from building the dozens of plutonium-based nuclear bombs that they could have built during the 90s, but did not prevent them from getting a head start on a program to make bombs from highly enriched uranium. We cannot know whether we could have prevented that if we had complied fully with the agreed framework. But we do know that the agreed framework, at the least, delayed the North Korean production of nuclear bombs by about a decade. In 1999, now I was out of the government, but a new crisis arose with North Korea over their test firing of a long-range missile. To us, that implied that they had kept something going in the nuclear program, because an ICBM makes no military sense unless you have a nuclear warhead to put on it. So we took that as evidence that they had some kind of a nuclear program still underway. There's a new crisis with many calls from the Congress for withdrawing from the agreed framework. And to deal with that crisis, Clinton asked me to come back out from Stanford and become his special representative to go to North Korea to deal with this problem. I requested and got support from a top diplomatic team from the Secretary of State, including Wendy Sherman, Philip Yoon, and Evans Revere, all of whom were experts in the issue we were talking about. And whatever success we had is due in large measure, I think, the contributions of these seasoned diplomats to our diplomacy. And our team drew heavily on the excellent work of Bob Gallucci and the agreed framework implementation team in New York. Then I made the process trilateral by bringing in Japanese and South Korean representatives as well. In a few months, our trilateral team had prepared a report which described the way forward. It called for coercive diplomacy, carrots, sticks, with a rich package of incentives not previously offered to North Korea, including offering to end the Korean War and diplomatic recognition of North Korea, including ultimately an embassy in Pyongyang. Our key guideline in putting this package together was we must deal with North Korea as it is and not as we would wish it to be. And those guidelines, I think, could serve today as well as in those days. In the latter half of 1999, our American team spent 4 days in Pyongyang negotiating an agreement whereby North Korea would agree to give up their nuclear and their long-range missile program. Talks followed the next 12 months by hopeful signs. Hopeful to me, anyway. North Korea had agreed to have their team march with the South Korean team in the 2000 Olympics, which I thought was a nice touch. And they also had a North-South summit meetings. Then in October of 2000, Kim Jong-il sent his senior military representative to Washington, and we met right here in this room. So I remember the meeting very well, to conclude the negotiation. And by the end of 2000, the deal was ready for the heads of state signing. But a funny thing happened at the end of 2000, which is called a U.S. election. And a new administration was voted in at that time. And President Clinton, although he could have signed the agreement in December, decided he should not commit the incoming president and passed it on to President Bush. Without going into the details of what happened, the Bush administration cut off the diplomacy, and for 2 years, there were no talks at all with North Korea. By that time, the Chinese were getting very concerned, and they stepped in and proposed something called the six-party talks, in which we participated for a number of years. They were hopeful, but fundamentally the result of those talks was North Korea conducted its first nuclear test a few years after they started. And in the ensuing years, North Korea has developed and tested both nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Today, they have a small arsenal of nuclear missiles, continue to build and test, and have developed and tested thermonuclear bombs. I still believe we could have averted that outcome if we had concluded the agreement in 2000, but we will never know that for sure. Last year, I argued there was still a possibility to stop or delay their nuclear program with diplomacy. By then, it was clear that the benefits of the diplomacy would be greatly reduced over what we were able to get in 2000, but still important. We could have stopped the program before they tested the thermonuclear weapons and before they tested their ICBMs. That opportunity for diplomacy was also passed up. At this time, sadly, I do not believe that any diplomacy I can conceive of will lead to North Korea giving up its nuclear arsenal. Their successful test for the thermonuclear bomb has now given them the essential data they need to build an arsenal of these deadly weapons. And their ICBM tests, including the one that just occurred, have given them enough data that they're unlikely to agree to stop testing until they have an operational ICBM, which I think is perhaps a year or two in the future. We cannot be certain, of course, that if we had seriously tried diplomacy, it would have been successful. But whatever opportunity there was, I believe, has now passed. If that is the case, we must now face the near certainty that North Korea will have within a few years the capability of delivering nuclear weapons to any country in the world, including South Korea, Japan, and the United States. We should not have let them get this capability, but they will soon have it as a result, I believe, of our abandoning diplomacy at critical times these past 2 decades. The question we must now face is, how do we best deter them from using this capability? We are down really to that option today. I want to be very clear that I do not believe that North Korea will use this arsenal in a surprise attack, an unprovoked attack. They have endured great economic hardships to build this arsenal because they believed that it was necessary to preserve their regime, that is, to sustain the Kim dynasty. But the regime is not suicidal. They are not seeking martyrdom. They are seeking to survive. And they know that if they launch a nuclear weapon against anybody, that their regime will be destroyed. Nevertheless, the nuclear arsenal is still very dangerous. It is all too easy to imagine scenarios in which they blunder into a nuclear war, especially if North Korea continues its practice of reckless provocations, and particularly if the leaders of North Korea and the United States continue to use the inflammatory and threatening rhetoric they've employed these past few months. The U.S. itself could create the conditions that could cause us to blunder into a nuclear war if we elect to make a conventional strike, military strike, against North Korea. As administration officials say, it is on the table. I understand that on the table is diplomatic talk where we don't know what we're going to do, but still, it is on the table. And I think it's very, very dangerous to do that. Such a strike would surely, in my opinion, would surely be followed by a North Korea conventional military strike against South Korea, which could all too easily escalate into the use of nuclear weapons. So what options do we have now? First, I think it is still useful to engage in diplomacy, but only if we do so with greatly lowered expectations. No diplomacy of which I can conceive is going to persuade North Korea today to give up its nuclear weapons. And if we go into diplomacy with that expectation, we are doomed to failure. But diplomacy could still be directed at the lesser but still important goal of lowering the likelihood of blundering into a nuclear war. That would be devastating for both Korea and Japan, as well as costly to the United States. And not, well, an all-out war, a nuclear war with North Korea, even if China and Russia did not enter it, could still entail casualties approximating those of World War I or World War II. Remember, whatever they do with their ICBMs, Seoul and Tokyo are today within the range of the nuclear weapons. Each of these cities have populations of about 20 million people. That is the danger already today, no matter what happens in their ICBM program. Given the terrible consequences of a nuclear war, our primary objective should be on deterring such a war. And whether or not we have any diplomacy underway with North Korea, we should have a serious requirement for diplomacy with our two allies and with China. Our allies will soon lead themselves to ask the painful question: would the United States be willing to sacrifice New York or Washington to save Seoul or Tokyo? And if they don't ask it themselves, the North Korean leadership will suggest they should be asking it. We should leave no doubt in the minds of the North Korean leaders that we will honor the commitments of extended deterrence to our allies. Equally, there should be no doubt in the mind of our allies that could take some real diplomacy, as well as some adjustments to our deployments. During the Cold War, some of you may remember, dealing with the doubts of the Germans that we would risk New York to save Bonn. Because of that, we agreed to deploy nuclear weapons in Germany, with the control of the weapons in the hands of the German Chancellor, as well as the American President. I do not believe that the deployment of nuclear weapons in South Korea is either necessary or desirable. I want to be very clear about that. But I do believe it's preferable to the collapse of the alliance, and it's preferable to the South Korea building an independent nuclear arsenal. These are difficult issues that will require skilled diplomacy. And it is fair to ask, will the reductions underway in the Foreign Service, will we have those skilled diplomats? I think the answer to that is yes, but I think we should be asking that question. In sum, events are already underway which require the U.S. to have diplomatic teams with the wisdom and experience to conduct very sophisticated diplomacy. Having said that, I want to conclude with the final statement. Regardless of what we do with our diplomacy, our number one task today, given what has already transpired, is to bolster up our deterrent capability. Thank you very much.